this is a look at essentially how we manage changing ecosystems in a world in which the people are making a lot of changes to the environment. And some of the talks will be about mosquitoes, and others will be about other species, and all of the talks will obviously, as we have seen just now, involve more than one species. So the first speaker is I'm going to give all the introductions right now, and then you can just come up and give the talks, and then we'll have a conversation with everyone afterwards. The three speakers will be up here. Okay, so just by brief introduction, I'm Boyce Thorne Miller. I'm a marine biologist now, mostly retired, but before I retired, I worked for a number of environmental organizations working on ocean issues. And I have authored a couple of books on marine biodiversity, so biodiversity is near and dear to my heart. The first speaker today will be Mayor Professor Dr. Philip Stoddard. I think I got them all. Phil is a professor of biological sciences at Florida International University and the third-term mayor of the city of South Miami. He's an integrative vertebrate zoologist and not a toxicologist, though he sometimes plays one on TV. And he has co-advised doctoral dissertations on mosquito biology and toxicology. Last year, Mayor Stoddard convinced his city commission to ban the application of biocides to public property, capturing the attention of the National Public Radio and PRI's Living on Earth. His current NSF-funded research is on signal reliability in animal communications.
So I think a lot of folks know, but not everybody knows, that there's a huge number of problems with over-application of insecticides. And one of the things I learned about recently was about people with multiple chemical sensitivity syndrome. And a lot of times these are folks who have been overexposed to something. For instance, one lady told me that somebody from the True Green company accidentally sprayed her in the face with insecticides, sprayed right through her kitchen window, got her in the face. And ever since then, she's hypersensitive. So if she gets exposed to just a wind drift of some insecticide, that she's debilitated for 6 months to a year. But there's 600 million people on the planet who have been overexposed to insecticides and are thus hypersensitive in this way. So we have these people living amongst us. In fact, a gentleman here who's got kids with this situation. We know what it's doing to our non-target animals. It's taking out the food supply for the birds. My first boss was Chan Robbins. He was Fish and Wildlife Service, who did the first experiments with DDT on songbirds. And he described watching warblers die in his hand from exposure. So we've known a lot about this, the problems with non-target organisms. And here's just some of the ones we worry about. But we've got our natural predators, the spiders and the dragonflies, and our pollinators, Lepidoptera and Hymenoptera. And they're all sensitive to overspraying, or spraying at all for that matter. And we have a lot of endangered species that I'm concerned about living in my city, South Miami. This is the Miami cave crayfish, and this is how we went looking for them in my backyard. We brought in a drill truck and drilled a giant hole. That's what it looks like now. And they're in there. They're living underneath Miami in the holes in the rock. The Florida talla butterfly is also endangered. And periodically they come and spray my yard and wipe these things out as well. Both of these are pineland species in Miami. They're both endangered from habitat loss and spraying combined. And the Florida bonneted bat is not only endangered, it's adorable. It's good to have a cute animal on your side when you're trying to find a mascot. And they have lovely social calls. They're in one of the groups of bats that sing songs. The males sing to the females. And they're also low enough that you can actually hear them with your ears. It's the only bat in the eastern U.S. that you can hear. and they're critically endangered. But all mosquitoes are not equally problematic. And so there's sort of two general sort of functional classes from a human perspective. There's the ones that carry diseases that we get, and there's the ones that just annoy the piss out of us. So here we've got Aedes aegypti, one of my least favorite mosquitoes because it carries things I really don't want to get, in particular dengue and chikungunya. And then this is one of the Culex species, which carries West Nile virus. We don't get very many Aedes albopictus in Miami, get a few. They can carry both. Now, this is the one that we spray for. We, meaning humans. We particularly like to spray for the black salt marsh mosquitoes because they're so obnoxious. And we have enabled this in the state of Florida through this fine Florida statute 388. And this is a particularly interesting little statute because it has a section on environmentally sensitive and biologically highly productive public lands. And it says that they may be subject to arthropod control measures, but it doesn't say they shall be. And so when I went and asked the local mosquito control board not to spray, they said, no, we have to spray. We have no option. So I went and started studying the statutes, and I thought, this is interesting. And then I find the opt-out clause, and it says, any public lands that are not identified as environmentally sensitive are subject to the local work plan. However, the arthropod control agency shall be deemed to be relieved of responsibility for arthropod control on parcels that have an effective plan that have been designated as either environmentally sensitive or biologically highly productive. So I start to think, I can't really claim that South Miami, which is suburban urban, is biologically highly productive. Now that would be something like a mangrove swamp, right? But environmentally sensitive, I've got all those endangered species living in my backyard. Clearly, it's an environmentally sensitive area. Okay. So we need a mascot, right? And the Miami cave crayfish is not going to do it. Maybe a butterfly, but I've got this incredibly adorable bat. And my wife and I had heard them on our evening walks, and I have a colleague at the university, Dr. Kirsten Bone, who studies bats. And so I said, Kesey, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make Miami love the bonneted bat. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had just put it up on the Federal Register for listing as an endangered species. So I start reading about this animal. We start looking for these bats, documenting their locations and so forth, and biding my time, waiting for the listing to go through. So it was red listed as a federally endangered species, rarest mammal in North America. It was time to move on this thing. So I got together with a wonderful young environmental writer for the Miami Herald, Jenny Stoletovic. There's Kesey Bone. And we started putting out stories in the Miami Herald. So endangered bats on the Coral Gables golf course. That's the easiest place to see them because it's wide open and they forage there. And then we held something called Bat Night. And we got Bacardi, which has a bat as their symbol, to sponsor this. And so we had Bacardi Bat Night at the Coral Gables golf course. We got hundreds of people to come out and see the bats. And we had all the electronics and everything else out there. And the bats put on a great show for us. People were delighted. They'd never seen bats before, and here they are flying around in front of them. So we got lots and lots of press coverage. Then, somebody taking their evening walk sees the bats coming out of a house roof. We got videos of them. Then the Bat Squad, Kesey's group, got recognized for protecting bat habitat. And all of Miami knew about bonneted bats and loved bonneted bats. Okay? You have to lay these things out carefully. You can't just spring this on people. So we've generated this whole movement of people who love the bonneted bat and want to protect the bat. Then butterfly world. So we have sort of the same parallel system up in Broward County to the north. Butterfly worlds. This guy, his family had this basically butterfly zoo forever. And it became a big celebrated thing up in Coconut Creek, Florida. And the town of Coconut Creek has Monarch High School, named for the monarch butterfly, and they have the annual Butterfly Festival. And they bring musicians in. There's U2 playing at the Butterfly Festival. But of course, they can't have their butterflies wiped out by insecticides, so they worked out a deal to not spray within 2 miles of Butterfly World because they were afraid of aerial drift of these insecticides. So if they can do it, I figured I can do it. Florida Keys, they've done the same thing. This is only about half the Keys, but you see all those red areas. Those are no spray zones. Monroe County's done it to the south of me. Broward County's done it to the north of me. I've got 2 examples. I've got everybody loving the bonneted bat, which eats insects which get wiped out by the insecticide spray. So it was time to try it. So we had a wildlife sanctuary ordinance to begin with, but it looked like it was something written in the last, 2 centuries prior. It was very archaic, talking about animals and fowl, something out of the Bible. So I rewrote it, and one of the rewrite provisions included Section D. It shall be unlawful to introduce into the public airspace broad-spectrum insecticides or biocides within the territorial limits of the city that may harm wildlife, the natural food supply for wildlife, pollinators, or natural biological control species. That's pretty much everything. You can probably find something that doesn't fit that definition, but it covers enough. And so I presented this to my city commission. They didn't seem any harm in it. It passed. We got some positive comments back from the residents. Passed second reading. Aha! I'm halfway there. Actually, a third of the way there. Here's the next part. Is a resolution. If you know how government works, you have a code of ordinances and you have resolutions that can do other things. So the code of ordinances is set. So we now declare South Miami to be an environmentally sensitive area. And this is going to be given to the city manager, who's going to communicate to the Miami-Dade Mosquito Control Division that we're basically opting out under the Florida statute. And these are the particular things that we've got going here. So we need a mosquito control plan that meets these criteria. No spraying, no aerial spraying, no truck-mounted spraying, and a realistic plan to notify residents in an area scheduled for spray application, including adequate time for residents to take precautions. But you notice it excludes truck-mounted spraying except to control a documented human disease outbreak, and then only with proper identification. So if we get a dengue outbreak, if we get a chikungunya outbreak, as much as I dislike insecticides, it's important that we knock it down fast, because these diseases are worse than the insecticides for most folks. And you don't want it to take hold and become a bigger problem, because then they'll spray everything. So this was the plan. We sent that over to the county. And the county has been not happy with me. The county mayor, whenever he sees me, goes like this. He swats himself. People would pass me on the sidewalk and swat themselves. But I got a lot of feedback from the residents after we did this. They didn't quite get it beforehand. After we passed it, they started writing me by the droves.
Next speaker is Ann Burd, attorney with the Center for Marine Biological I always say marine, sorry. Center for Biological Diversity, and you're based in Portland, is that right? Yes. Okay. Ann will talk about her experience as an endangered species advocate and attorney working with scientists, citizens, and agency staff to stop the aerial spraying of toxic pesticides for mosquito control in a national wildlife refuge in Oregon. She will address the importance of preventing the extinction of endangered species, the threats of both invasive species and pesticides to the critically imperiled species, and ways that activists and scientists can work together to help protect ecosystems from toxic chemicals.
Hi, I'm delighted to be participating in this panel. I'm Ann Burd. I'm the Environmental Health Director at the Center for Biological Diversity. I've worked on pesticide issues in various capacities for over a dozen years, and it's great to see some familiar and new friendly faces here today. I am going to start off talking about invasive species, and particularly the threat of invasive species to biodiversity and threatened and endangered species, so that when we approach these issues, we know actually what we're looking at and what we're dealing with. And then once we're thoroughly depressed, I'm going to share a victory story, the story of how we stopped a really bad mosquito spraying project at the Abandoned Marsh National Wildlife Refuge. For those of you who don't know the center, I'm going to read you our mission. I think it's pretty great, so I like to read it often. At the Center for Biological Diversity, we believe that the welfare of human beings is deeply linked to nature, to the existence in our world of a vast diversity of wild animals and plants. Because diversity has intrinsic value, and because its loss impoverishes society, we work to secure a future for all species, great and small, hovering on the brink of extinction. We want those who come after us to inherit a world where the wild is still alive. Bad news. We are in the midst of the 6th great extinction. And this extinction, unlike all others, is caused by one species, us. Pesticide use is devastating for threatened and endangered species, and the center has a long and storied history working to protect species from the harms of pesticides. The center's campaign against pesticides has utilized creative communication, policy, and litigation to challenge both existing and new pesticides. On the litigation front, I'll just mention a few things that we're doing, and we're working with partners on all of these, some of whom are in this room. We recently challenged a California plan to approve a new pesticide use plan that would allow pesticide spraying adjacent to schools and homes. We have a nationwide pesticide case that's working to ensure compliance with the Endangered Species Act on the use on pesticides that are already in widespread use. And more recently, we've challenged a new neonicotinoid called fliperidiferone, or FLUPY as we call it, that is particularly harmful for solitary bees. And we've also worked with our partners at the Center for Food Safety and other groups to challenge Enlist Duo, which is the next generation of highly toxic GE technology that will allow for a new, increasingly toxic chemical cocktail to be used. Is that better if I put this up here? A new cocktail of 2 herbicides to be used on crops that are engineered to be resistant. As I launch into talking about invasive species, I just want to note that this issue is extremely complex. Every ecosystem is unique and presents its own unique set of factors. We all understand the significant harms associated with pesticide use, and I want to make sure that we also all understand the role of invasive species in our current biodiversity crisis. Invasive species are the 2nd largest threat to threatened and endangered species after habitat loss. At least 40% of Endangered Species Act listed species are on that list, listed species and candidates are on that list, at least in part due to invasive species, and some solely because of invasive species. I want to point out that invasive species are distinct from introduced species. There are many, many, many introduced species out there. The vast majority of introduced species are not invasive. Invasives are characterized by quick growth and reproduction, their aggressive spread, and the harm they cause to ecosystems. The direct threats they cause are preying on and outcompeting native species. The indirect threats are larger and more systemic. They change entire food webs, they decrease biodiversity, and they alter ecosystem conditions. This is English ivy. It's taken over all of Portland's urban forests. It's the stuff on the trees. This is picture is at Tryon State Park. This is the state park in the backyard of Lewis and Clark Law School, where I went to school and went running every day. Once English ivy takes hold, it wipes out most other species, including the trees that it strangles that you can see in this picture. This impacts the entire ecosystem. Wildflowers, butterflies, bees, the adorable salamanders that need wet down wood, everything gets wiped out. 31% of U.S. native plants are at risk of extinction. Only 11% of those are protected under the Endangered Species Act, so there's a huge problem with native plants getting wiped out, and invasive species are a big part of that. One really incredible thing that you can see if you come visit me in Portland, I'll take you to, is areas in our urban forests where we've had restoration work done, where people have pulled the ivy. I used to pull ivy for a living. On one side of the trail, and areas where you have the ivy on the other side of the trail, and areas where the ivy has been pulled are alive. They're full of birds and bugs and flowers. Areas where there's ivy, there's just ivy, and it has this kind of peculiar dead smell to it. It's really amazing seeing the difference, and even if the ivy was pulled like 2 weeks ago, you'll see like ferns starting to flourish. All these choked out ferns will actually grow and flourish, and you'll see all these animals start to come back. This is Scotch broom. When I first moved to Oregon, I thought it was so cool that the roadsides were covered in these beautiful yellow flowers. I thought this was like a great perk of moving to Oregon. I was very sad to learn that Scotch broom is an incredibly invasive species. It takes over all the ecosystems it infests. One ecosystem that it's currently destroying is rare Oregon white oak woodland, and that's actually our rarest ecosystem in Oregon. It crowds out all other species and is a major threat to threatened and endangered species, plants, animals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, butterflies. One endangered butterfly that is particularly near and dear to my heart is the Fender's blue butterfly, greatly imperiled by this plant. It lives in the Willamette Valley and relies on a lupin for its survival. Scotch broom shades out the lupin. Lupin dies, butterfly dies, gets wiped out. Tiny habitat, big deal. Other species, western pocket gopher, yellow Indian paintbrush, and many more. Another major invasive species threat are Roundup-resistant superweeds. About 60 million acres in the United States are currently infested with Roundup-resistant superweeds. They're the result of us using, of the vast majority of U.S. acreage and agriculture being genetically engineered plants. We currently use 250 million pounds of glyphosate on just corn and soy in the U.S. 400 million pounds total in agriculture are used. And so weeds are clever and tricky, and so they've evolved to be resistant to this stuff. The horrible thing about it is that many land managers are like, oh, we'll just use nastier chemicals on it, and so we're seeing increased uses of some of the older chemicals that were particularly harmful to the environment. So what can we do? We need to recognize this as a big problem. I think recognize that these areas infested by these invasive species are not self-sustaining ecosystems. Some people call them novel ecosystems, and that's really inappropriate characterization. The hallmark of an ecosystem is that it is self-sustaining. Areas infested by invasives have not even been around long enough for us to know if they could eventually become self-sustaining. So we need to recognize the urgent need to restore these ecosystems to a place where they can be self-sustaining. Pesticides are not the answer, but neither is walking away. I believe we have a moral obligation to prevent extinction. I've witnessed some horrible pesticide spraying for invasive species in the Blue Mountains in Oregon, where they did aerial spraying for pesticides for thistle that were spread by this totally inappropriate grazing that was happening in the forest during bighorn lambing, and lo and behold, a lot of these lambs were dying. It's awful. And so is extinction. It's a huge mistake to pit threatened and endangered species against the need to control invasives. Threatened and endangered species are imperiled both by invasives and pesticides, and we need to be squarely on the same page, advocating for ecosystem health and biodiversity. There are a lot of ways to do this. I'm not going to get into them in detail because, like I said, every ecosystem is unique, and the appropriate methods for each ecosystem can vary. I will note that we hear a lot of pushback on manual control and that it's impossible and too expensive. Renting a helicopter to aerially spray is incredibly expensive as well, and so I personally think manual control is an excellent way to address these issues and pretty cost effective if you look at some of the cost of the widespread aerial spraying. So, who's depressed? Anyone? Anyone else depressed? Oh, good. Oh, good. No one else is depressed, huh? I guess I haven't done a good job. I'm going to take questions. We're going to take questions at the end. So I'm going to turn to success story. I'm sharing the story of how activists, attorneys, and scientists can work together to stop harmful pesticide spraying. And I hope this inspires us to reach out to people that we wouldn't normally work with. I'm an attorney. I'm also a human, and I'm an activist. And I'm reasonably pleasant to work with. I know some people don't like to work with attorneys. You might find that we're not so bad. Some people think scientists are impossible to work with. My experience is different. I think it's really, we can get a lot done, and I hope this story will illustrate how much we can get done when we reach out to our allies with a common cause. This story started one fine September day when I was working at the Center for Food Safety, and I received an anonymous call. Anonymous call. You get a lot of these kinds of calls working in a conservation group where someone is telling you about an urgent crisis, and oftentimes they're correct to be reporting it. This person informed me that the very next day, Fish and Wildlife Service was getting U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was getting ready to spray 300 acres in a national wildlife refuge with a highly toxic pesticide called Metalarv, or cocoa bear. Weird name for a pesticide, like makes it sound like a snuggly chocolate bear, but it's not. Bandon Marsh is a national wildlife refuge along the southern Oregon coast. It's the largest remaining salt marsh in the region. They're doing a historic restoration project. It's going to be the largest salt marsh restoration project in history. This area is an oasis for many fish and bird species, including threatened and endangered species. During the restoration, Fish and Wildlife Service inadvertently created an area of still water, and this led to a proliferation of these marsh mosquitoes that everyone hated, that were coming out during the day and biting people, and everyone was very shocked by these mosquitoes that came out during the day. They weren't used to them. There is a golf course adjacent to the National Wildlife Refuge, and people were unable to golf because of how many mosquitoes were out there. And an Oregon senator was very upset because people could not take pictures at his scenic land viewpoint because the mosquitoes were so bad. The county declared a public health emergency. As I've mentioned, and I'll keep mentioning, every situation is unique and every ecosystem is different. In Florida, you truly have public health emergencies with mosquitoes. In Oregon, the emergency was declared after someone went to the hospital because they had too many mosquito bites and they scratched them too much and they got a skin infection. So this, in our mind, was not truly a public health emergency. The marsh is habitat to threatened coho salmon, and the entire area was brimming with life. Unfortunately, it was the afternoon when we got the call, and it was too late to run to court to get a temporary restraining order and stop the action. I stayed up that whole night and thought about all the animals and plants and birds and fish that were going to die the next day because we were unable to do anything. And the next day, they sprayed early in the morning, and all these creatures died. So, we took action. These are two bees in a flower. I thought it was kind of two peas in a pod. Get it? It's cute. We teamed up with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. They have incredible expertise in the issue of mosquito control, and I was fortunate enough to team up with a scientist who wrote her thesis dissertation on mosquito control. They sent a letter to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service offering their technical expertise and help. Fish and Wildlife Service had already spoken to the media about their plans to continue to do this spraying throughout the fall and then in the spring again and in the coming years. So Xerces took that approach of going to the agency and letting them know that they were ready and able to provide them with the expertise they needed to not do this again. I'm a lawyer. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests. Freedom of Information Act requests can have two functions. One, if the agency responds, and they should respond, you will get documents that give you a much better ability to assess the situation, understand the context of what's happening, and move forward in a more informed way. The second thing they do is they let the agency know you're watching them. They let the agency know you're willing to put the resources into this to at least write them this letter requesting the documents, and you're going to be reviewing them, and you're going to get familiar with the situation and maybe even want to take some action on it. We were determined to make sure that the agency complied with the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act in any action that they were going to take moving forward. So Fish and Wildlife Service started studying the issue. Here's a researcher looking at samples out in the marsh. And they released a draft environmental assessment in March. This is notable because they had September, October, November, December, January, February, March. What happens in March? It starts getting warmer. The mosquitoes are about to hatch. We basically have a gun to our head. They've told us everyone is going to hate your guts if the mosquitoes hatch again, and we have this huge infestation. So we're really trying to fight the clock here. The proposal in the draft environmental assessment was to do exactly what they had done in the fall, which was to spray with meadowlarvae. We were obviously pretty disappointed. We teamed up again with the Xerces Society, and we submitted excellent comments which combined our scientific and legal expertise. And the agency asked to meet with us. We had some really gnarly negotiation. But we were really well prepared, and we had this combination of expertise that allowed us to go into this meeting with confidence that we had a proposal that would work and that would be less toxic. And a month later, the agency issued a final environmental assessment going with the plan that we had proposed. We won. The agency agreed to do extensive monitoring in the National Wildlife Refuge, check the samples like they are in this picture, and use BTI, which is a natural bacteria that you can use in organic farming and other organic practices, on areas where there were mosquitoes, not areas where there weren't mosquitoes, which is what Ariel pesticide spraying would do, and actually address the issue in a much more holistic way. We were very happy. But we were nervous all summer, wanting to see what was going to happen with the mosquitoes, and I'm thrilled to report that the mosquito problem has abated. They had no major issues last year. I just read their monitoring report, their most recent monitoring report this morning. Everything seems to be going well. They're continuing to take samples. Mosquito numbers are lower than they were last year, obviously much lower than they were the year before, and it seems that our plan has worked. So I hope that story inspires you moving forward to stop bad mosquito spraying projects. Thank you very much, and I think we'll take your questions at the end.
Okay, our final speaker is Dr. Ariel Lugo, who you all probably heard give a talk a little bit earlier this afternoon. I'll just repeat that he is director of the International Institute of Tropical Forestry of the USDA Forest Service in Puerto Rico. He's an ecologist and founding member of the Society of Ecological Restoration. And he has studied tropical forests in Puerto Rico for how many years? Many years. And I think I don't know what his talk is, but I think he will give us some alternative views of ecosystems with introduced species.
So what I want to do is just a reflection. There's a lot of conflict going on with species, you know. They get classified in many ways: introduced, naturalized, invasive, endemic, native, non-native. There's just a lot of terminology that just confuses the whole issue of how do you go about managing ecosystems. And then this business of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is the era that we live in, replacing the Holocene being the Ice Age, which is now ended, and we entered the era of human domination. And so, when you were depressing us, you were telling us all the bad things that humans do. Humans do a lot of stuff. This is a list that I came up with, and I don't think that we cannot, it includes everything, and we do so many things that we're changing the whole Earth. The whole planet is changing so much that the geologists now call it the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, the era of human domination. And that has incredible implications for anybody that is a conservationist or is trying to deal with natural systems, because we need to answer that question. If humans are doing all that stuff, all the changes that they're doing, how does the modifications that we're doing, how does the biota adapt? How does the biota react? And remember that the thing that makes this Earth incredible is that organisms have adaptations. They evolve. They have seen a lot of change over time, and humans are just the latest volcano or something. So here's a conceptual diagram, so that for you to think about. You have this whole global biota, and it's being shoved, transplanted all over the world by people in airplanes, in ships, in pockets. People move seed, they move organisms all over the place, and we can do that because we live in a civilization that allows people to move things all over the world, and so take your favorite place, but Portland or Puerto Rico or Miami, whatever. You have your local species and you have your local conditions, but you also have the new conditions that humans are imposing. So humans are changing conditions everywhere they exist. And when that happens, then you mix these species, you mix the local species with the introduced species, and the magic of ecology takes place. And what's happening is that we're creating new mixing, new species combinations, and they call novel ecosystems. Lori doesn't like the term novel ecosystems, but I'm going to show you how novel ecosystems really are happening all over the place. And I'm just going to give you one example. But the bottom line is that the living world is being reorganized because human activity that is creating these new conditions. And so conservation of biodiversity requires a new approach. You need to deal with changing environment. And what does that mean? So this is the kind of mixing that is happening. The beautiful flower is an endangered tree species in my island. This is Gosea elegans is something that we love, but it's going extinct, and approaching it is an animal that we hate. The African bee. The African bee kills. He's killed biologists. So, an introduced species, an invasive species, an endangered rare species. But luckily, when they interact ecologically. They don't, the plant doesn't ask for the bee for the passport. Where are you from? The plant requires pollination, and the Africanized bee turns out that it's a better pollinator. And so this is a doctoral dissertation that concluded that this endangered plant is being saved by this invasive bee. And it is a metaphor of what's happening on Earth because of the mixing of species and the activities of people that are changing the conditions of life. So what we do in the Forest Service is we do inventories. We've been inventorying Puerto Rico completely, the whole island, since 1980. We measure everything, every tree has a tag, identified, counted, all that stuff, mapped. And here you see what's been happening in the island since 1980. The importance of native species has been in steady decline, and the importance of introduced, these are tree species, steady increasing. So there is a change in the composition of the forest of the whole island, tropical island, with a lot of diversity. And because we have all these mapped, we can do a high-resolution map of Puerto Rico, where everything you see in red is an ecosystem that has introduced invasive species in it. Everything you see in dark green is pure native forest. The native forest representing the original forest composition that we had in that island, and the rest are the novel forests. Now, if you go to Puerto Rico as a tourist, or if you are a biologist in Puerto Rico or a Puerto Rican moving around, you don't know the difference. The forests, they look the same, they have the same functioning, they are sustaining, they have diversity, they have wildlife, they have all this stuff that we study, but the biological composition has changed fundamentally, and it has changed fundamentally not only for the plants, but it's also changed for the animals. And these are pictures of these novel systems that we have in Puerto Rico, and they're actually attractive, and they look like normal forests, but when you look at the textbooks, they were not there at the beginning of the century. They have come up as a result of human activity. Now, you say in the United States, what's the story? Well, the Forest Service is in the United States too, and we do also do inventories of the forests of the United States. Everything you see in color on the East Coast represents the forest stands in our FIA plots, Forest Inventory and Analysis. FIA is what we call them. When we do these plots, you look at the species, and they all have introduced species in them. I was surprised to see this map, because all in the eastern United States, you barely see any green, which is the original forest composition in these inventories. A lot of people don't realize it, because these novel systems, like I said, they look alike as the others. You have to be like a taxonomist or a dendrologist to know your species, to understand that the species composition has changed. Look at the West. The West is pretty green, except there's some lighter shades, which indicate some instances where introduced species are coming into the forest. My only point is that the world is changing, and the species composition is changing, and that puts a certain angle on how you approach conservation. So this is my last point. We have an emerging new world order, which involves these combinations of species and environmental conditions, and unfortunately, we can't move backwards. We cannot move backwards because the Earth itself is changing. The Anthropocene with humans dominating, doesn't have the cyclic behavior that used to be present in the past. And now what we're facing is uncertainty. Climate change is taking us places where we don't know. We have not been there, and we don't know how to deal with them. So uncertainty is what characterizes this new world order. And so the science that is needed to deal with these new conditions is a holistic, transdisciplinary science. Now, transdisciplinary is a term also that you might have heard, but it goes beyond interdisciplinary. Interdisciplinary is something that we used to do 20, 30 years ago. Transdisciplinary is where we involve the knowledge of everybody, all the scientific knowledge in ways not in the traditional sense, but in an integrated sense, and also the knowledge of local people, knowledge that is outside of science, because in dealing with uncertainty, the more information you have, the better the opportunity that you might be able to hit the right level of understanding. And so this transdisciplinary science is going to provide clarified mythology, explain paradoxes, like the paradoxes that I show of invasive species interacting with endemic species, and like that there are many that are developing now. It minimizes value-laden decision-making and policy, because we all grow accustomed to whatever we saw in our childhood, and we want to keep the environment or the familiar species with us, and so it's going to be very difficult for us to devalue what we value and then accept something that is completely new to us. This is a real problem in conservation, and allow you to do real costs and benefits, and as well as the sustainability of conservation activities. I should say that for me, conservation is management. It's the same thing. Any intervention that we do in nature, it has to be supported by solid science, and so that if you do that, you might be able to get closer to sustainability than if you go by sheer instincts. So that's a view of how we're facing, and maybe as much as we would like to go back to familiar combinations, maybe it's impossible.